Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Conservation Training Center. My name is John O'Connell, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. Today's webinar is titled Transboundary Connectivity Conservation for a Changing Climate, and we're excited to have Mead Crosby with us today. So to introduce our presenter, we have Nicole DeCrapio from the Northwest Science Center. Nicole is the director out there. Nicole, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm really pleased to introduce Mead. Mead Crosby is a senior scientist with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and is also the University Deputy Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Mead works really closely with land and wildlife managers to collaboratively understand and address climate impacts on species and ecosystems. Her current work includes vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning, large landscape conservation planning for climate resilience, and efforts to build climate adaptation capacity and communities of practice. Mead received a BS in biology from Cornell University and her PhD in biology from the University of Washington. Please take it away, Mead.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Something that I care a lot about, which is connectivity conservation and climate resilience. So I'm going to talk about two projects actually that I've led that have been funded by the Northwest CAS. And one of the projects was completed a few years ago, and one of them is underway right now, and that builds off of the earlier work. So both of these efforts aim to support transboundary connectivity conservation in the Northwest in a changing climate. So how do we ensure that species are able to move across the landscape, and in particular across jurisdictional boundaries as the climate changes? And that's important because we know that moving, so shifting their geographic range, is one of the key ways that species adapt to climate change. So political borders can pose significant barriers to climate-driven movement of plants and animals. And it's a little bit of a trigger warning here. Some of these barriers are pretty catastrophic. So like the wall that's being built along the US-Mexico border. This is kind of a worst-case scenario for a barrier for climate-driven species movement. So this wall is being built east-west. That's directly in the path of poleward range shifts by species. But some of these barriers are more subtle. So up here at the border of Washington and British Columbia in the Pacific Northwest, we also have a border that runs east-west in the path of poleward range shifts. And yes, caveat, species are moving individualistically, but on average, globally, we're seeing shifts towards the poles and upward in elevation. So we don't have a wall up here, thank God, and we have a lot of really lovely natural north-south and elevational corridors in our public lands that are in relatively good condition. So you can see, hopefully see my arrow here, but we have the Cascade Mountain Range here, much of which is public land. We have our arid lands of the Columbia Plateau, which have a nice corridor up here through the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. And then over here we have the Rockies. So we don't have a wall, but the border poses more of a barrier to connectivity than you might think. So for example, land use often isn't coordinated between Washington and British Columbia. So you can have land in really good condition on one side of the border, like here, and then you have logging going on the other side. We also have cases over here, like in the Okanagan and the north end of the Columbia Plateau, our shrub steppe ecosystems, where on the US side of the border, this is our far northern part of the country. This area is really pretty sparsely populated, whereas on the British Columbia side in Canada, this is like, the Okanagan Valley is like the hottest, driest place in Canada. It's like the Palm Springs of Canada. So folks really want to live here. People have summer homes here, retirement communities, they're building golf courses, there's vineyards and wineries. So we have really different development pressures going on both sides of the border. And again, development isn't necessarily being coordinated across the border. And so if we want to conserve habitat connectivity across the border, our ability to use science to identify key corridors for maintaining or restoring connectivity under climate change is also challenged not just by land management disconnect across the border, but also by the data that's available to guide those decisions. So often connectivity or climate models stop at the border. So they're either available only in British Columbia or only in the Northwest US, but they don't cross the border. And I can tell you from experience, that's often because the base layers that we use to build these models often don't cross the border. When you do find data sets or model outputs that are transboundary, if you zoom in at the border, you'll notice often really strange things happening where, again, because a lot of the underlying data is not the same, you wind up with kind of strange quirks and eccentricities as you cross the border. So it's not quite the same thing you're getting on either side of the border. It's not seamless. So we have data barriers at the border, and that can make science-based decision-making more difficult. And then we also have people barriers. So we have institutional barriers at the border. We have land and wildlife managers who are on either side of the border who aren't talking to each other. They're not coordinating their activities. They often don't even know who their counterpart is across the border. And very frequently, they don't have the capacity to access, interpret, and apply the best available climate or connectivity models to their decision making. So we have all kinds of things going on that's making it really hard to ensure that we have adequate connectivity in this transboundary area that would allow species to adapt. And so the first project that I'm going to talk about is the Washington, British Columbia Transboundary Climate Connectivity Project. The goal of this project was to engage science management partnerships to apply the best available science to inform management activities affecting land and wildlife connectivity in the transboundary region. And we have been scoping this transboundary region for several years to figure out what the information needs were to support decision-making for connectivity conservation and climate change, like what science was needed, what models were they needed. We were super excited. I was involved with the Washington Connected Landscapes Project, and we've done several years worth of work building connectivity models for species and ecosystems around Washington and surrounding areas. And so we were excited to see how people were using them and what new science we could do. And I remember being at a workshop around the border and asking a group of managers, okay, what models do you need to guide your decision-making around climate and connectivity? And I got a total deer in the headlights response, like, we are completely overwhelmed. We know that climate change is important. We know connectivity is important, but we don't even know what to do with the information that's currently out there, let alone what new science we need. So the message was really clear that no new models. We do not want new models. We want help accessing, interpreting, and applying existing models. And so my excitement to build new models went screeching to a halt. I was like, okay, we need to have a project where we focus on using existing models to ask how we can adapt connectivity conservation to climate change. And so we convened a suite of science management partnerships to work together to gather, interpret, and apply existing data sets to identify climate impacts to connectivity in the transboundary region, and then also identify adaptation actions for addressing those impacts. So because this is kind of a scale-sensitive issue, people are making decisions at different scales with different relevant partners. We identified 3 nested partnerships. And again, here's the border running east-west. And so at this broad scale here around the whole transboundary region outlined in brown, we have the U.S. Forest Service to the south and the National Park Service to the south. And then we have BC Parks and BC Forest Lands Natural Resource Operations, which was BC FLNRO, and now is even more of a mouthful of BC FLNROD because they include development in there now, but this was a few years ago. So our second partnership here outlined in yellow was the Okanagan Kettle region. So this was a more geographically sort of narrowly defined area of the area surrounding the Okanagan Valley, that place that's under a lot of development pressure to the north here and is really important for species moving through the Columbia Plateau. And here the partnership was predetermined by the Washington Connected Landscapes Project, which I mentioned a moment ago. They were doing a more local scale analysis because we had identified this as a really key region in earlier work. They were engaging all kinds of land and wildlife managers and local stakeholders to look for local priority areas for connectivity conservation in this region. And so we worked with them to incorporate climate change into that analysis. And then our third partnership was with the Okanagan Nation Alliance to the north and the Colville Confederated Tribes to the south. This is a people that have been divided arbitrarily by this border. And we worked at the scale of the traditional territory of the Okanagan Nation Alliance and their member bands. The science partners for all of this were the UW Climate Impacts Group where I work, and then the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium to the north. So they're in Victoria, we're in Seattle, and we do really similar work. Both of us, all of our work is centered around working with decision makers to incorporate climate change into what they do, to identify impacts to the things that they manage and care about, and adaptation strategies and actions for ameliorating those impacts. So it was a really cool opportunity to work together to compare notes on how we do this work, build our own collaboration, and then look, again, at another opportunity at looking at those data barriers, because each of us also produces the kind of science that informs these decisions. And so it was a great chance to work with them on that. So after some initial discussions with the partners, so one of our first workshops was really just trying to figure out, okay, what decisions are you making? What are you doing? What are your priorities? And what are your concerns about climate change and connectivity? And after these initial discussions of just getting to know the decision-making context and what folks were doing, we decided to focus our work to make it more manageable because there were such diverse partners involved in this work. To make it manageable, we decided to focus our work on a suite of case study species and vegetation communities, from salmon to sagebrush steppe to wolverine to tiger salamander. Again, these are case studies. They're not supposed to be umbrella species because we know that concept breaks down under climate change because everyone's to some extent doing their own thing. But we selected these carefully because they not only are they shared priorities across the border, but they also are subject to, they have very different climate sensitivities and exposures, and would likely have different adaptation actions as well. So by looking at a diverse suite of species and systems, we wanted the managers to be exposed to a wide range of climate sensitivities and impacts. So some species will be really sensitive to fire, for example. Some species have really different movement ecologies. The actions you could take for a species versus a whole vegetation system would be really different. And so the idea was that if we could develop a process for them for thinking about how to apply climate change and connectivity to their decision making, that this could be replicated for any number of species or systems, and they could work with their colleagues to expand this. And so we just wanted to make sure that we were providing something really tractable that we could focus this work on. So once we had our list of case studies, we then had to figure out how to use the range of available existing connectivity models of projected change in climate and related impacts, models of projected species range shifts, all of the different existing data that was available that often isn't consistent across the border, and then how to apply these to identify climate impacts on connectivity, understand novel movement needs under climate change, and identify adaptation actions for addressing these impacts. And again, no new models, so only existing models. And in general, we tried to pick models that were freely available, that anyone could use, and that were fairly consistent across the border as much as we could make that so. The one exception to the no new models was the conceptual models. So because these were such complicated questions, like how is climate change going to affect the species movement? That's a really complicated, big, unwieldy question. We wound up taking a conceptual model approach, and this allows you to, if you're not familiar with these, it allows you to take a really complicated system and break it down into its key components. In this case, it allows us to ask the key questions of what landscape features affect connectivity for a species, which of them are influenced by climate, how will future changes in climate affect those features and thus connectivity, and then where can we intervene in this? And where is there data available for us to understand these impacts? So here's an example from wolverine. So we wanted to capture the relationship between key landscape features, and those are the things in the white boxes, the key landscape features, ecological processes, which are in purple, human activities in blue, and then all of these things influence the quality and the permeability of wolverine core habitat and dispersal habitat. And then here we overlaid climatic variables where we had data that could tell us about projected changes. Those are the things that are outlined in yellow. So we have good data on projected changes in snowpack and tree cover, pests and pathogens, summer water deficit and fire, things that might all affect tree cover and the snags and coarse woody debris that are important to core habitat, for example, for wolverine. And then you can see the relationship between these and their core and dispersal habitat with the arrows, where green is roughly a positive correlation and orange is roughly a negative correlation. And again, these don't necessarily mean that it's better or worse for it, but that's roughly the correlation between them. So once we had these conceptual models, again, we could see very simply what affects its connectivity, and then how climate might influence those, and then where did we actually have data sets that could tell us something about how that climate impact might play out, which would then allow us to think about where we could intervene and identify adaptation actions. If you're not familiar with this, Molly Cross has and colleagues have a really great paper. I can't remember the exact name, but if you look up Molly Cross and it's ACT, it's ACT is the acronym for this conceptual model approach, but it's such a handy approach. I've used it not just for this, but it winds up popping into my head for all kinds of problems I'm trying to tackle in our work. Okay, so once we had our conceptual model where we can identify climate impacts and intervention points, we can also then use our connectivity and climate relevant models to identify priority areas for connectivity conservation. So we can use the spatial information here with what we learned from our conceptual model approach to think about where we might want to implement the actions, the interventions we identify for the most impact for those species or systems. And we did all of this work collaboratively through workshops with our project partnerships. So the scientists from the Climate Impacts Group and the scientists from PKIC, and then all of those land and wildlife managers from both sides of the border, we sat down together and we worked out together how to develop these conceptual models, which we then also vetted, again, with some outside experts who might not have been in our region specifically or working on this project specifically, but we did a lot of vetting of those conceptual models. And then we worked together to explore how existing climate and connectivity model outputs could help us identify climate impacts on transboundary connectivity and help us identify adaptation actions to address those impacts. And so you're looking at it like these are all climate model output, connectivity model outputs, and it's really just poring over these and building folks' capacity to understand what they do and don't mean, how to interpret them, and then how we can apply that to folks' actual decision making. So really demystifying these models and getting folks familiar with how they can use them and providing an approach that's could be applied to any number of questions around climate and or connectivity for their decision making. So in the proposal I put together for the project, I had imagined, I think I wrote in that we would have 2 big workshops where we'd have like breakout for all the partner groups. But with these co-production efforts, these efforts that are really designed and carried out collectively in collaboration with the scientists and the practitioner partners, you really don't know what's going to work until you get into it, because these are people projects. And so ultimately, this turned into closer to a dozen different events that ranged from workshops like this to smaller meetings where we just had to go to individual partners to talk with them about their needs and work with them on some of this. With intervening phone calls, we eventually started having a series of smaller sort of webinars and discussions. So it wound up being much more interactive and iterative than I had initially planned. And I wound up doing quite a bit of leveraging with other smaller grants. I wrote found a bunch of other smaller pots of money to fill in these gaps. So, doing co-production work like this, you have to be nimble and pretty entrepreneurial. And so the project did evolve from what I had initially imagined, but it wound up, I think that was a really important thing to be responsive to what folks were able to do in terms of their engagement and respond to that. And even then, even with like all that planning and additional funds and stuff, it was hard to get people in the same room, especially when that meant getting people across the border. So managers often never met their counterparts across the border, the folks who did the same kind of work that they did on the other side. They often didn't even know who that counterpart was. And so organizing workshops that would allow these folks to interact was really important, but it was also challenged by constraints around travel and international travel in particular. We had a bunch of folks who either weren't allowed to travel internationally at all, or maybe they could make like one trip total per year, even if we provided the funding. And so we got creative. So for example, we discovered that there's a day use facility in the Peace Arch Park. This is a peace park that's along the Interstate 5 border crossing between Washington and British Columbia. And at these peace parks, folks from either side of the border can meet in the park without ever having to technically cross the border. You don't have to, it doesn't count as international travel to meet at the border at these peace parks. And so we were able to get folks together and actually you can see the Peace Arch right here in the background with the little Canadian flag and the US flag. So we were able to get folks together there as a workaround to these travel restrictions. So again, if we want to coordinate transboundary coordination and collaboration among managers and scientists, just getting folks in the same room can be a major challenge. But we did it, and ultimately we were able to use this approach with our conceptual models, along with really exploring and pouring through these climate and connectivity models, as well as the local knowledge and expertise of the land and wildlife managers, to identify specific climate impacts on connectivity for each of these case study species and systems, everything from increasing risk of wildfire, decreasing snowpack, changes in vegetation, invasive species, changes in seed dispersal, stream temperatures, decreasing stream flow. So a wide range of climate impacts we were able to identify from those conceptual models and the climate-related models that we had on how these would affect connectivity for these key species. And then we were able to identify a whole suite of adaptation actions that could work from anything from just, a couple of these species and systems to a wide range of them. And so these ones that work across a whole bunch, these might be really good big bang for buck options. So for example, in the arid lands on the east side, this is not as much an issue on the west side of the Cascades, but in that more arid land area and the lower slopes of the Cascades and Rockies, prescribed burns are obviously a really important intervention for preventing the kind of catastrophic wildfires that can alter connectivity and habitat value. And so that's a really powerful intervention for maintaining connectivity conservation as well for these species. For changes in vegetation that could affect connectivity, we all know that monitoring is so important and is so underfunded and underutilized. But again, for so many of these species, that's going to be a key thing. And so if we can't get folks to invest in people doing some of this stuff on the ground, maybe we can use LiDAR, remote sensing, other technologies to get that kind of info for a larger area that would help a whole bunch of our case study species. So in addition to looking at actions to address climate impacts and connectivity, we looked at actions that will enhance connectivity to facilitate species range shifts. So for example, if we want to facilitate geographic range shifts for these species, one of the things that would be helpful across these species would be looking for corridors that span, for example, elevational gradients. And this is, for many of these species, this is a twofer in that it's something that's important right now. A lot of these species make elevational movements seasonally, and it will become more important under climate change as they need to perhaps go even higher in the at some seasons, and perhaps as a proxy for moving north as well, which is another option. So climate gradient corridors in general were important. We also wanted to look at spatial priorities for implementing climate connectivity adaptation options or actions. And there are a whole bunch of options here, but some things that are important across many species. We're looking for climate resilient core areas and corridors to maintain connectivity. And so areas that are projected to remain climatically suitable. And this is not just from species range shift models. And we, by the way, in using species range shift models, we were very careful to do things like not look at a single model output, but we we worked a lot with the managers to understand uncertainty and how to account for uncertainty in these models. So for example, not just looking at the model mean output, but looking at the distribution of possible futures under different global circulation models, different climate models, and making sure to look at the outliers as well. So picking the hottest, driest future, for example, the much less hot, so the relatively cooler, wetter future, as well as the model mean for different climate scenarios, so different carbon emission scenarios. And so for any one species range shift model, we might have a whole suite of possible futures that come out of the models. And we're looking across those to see if there's agreement among those models in areas that look important across a range of models, or if there's just so much uncertainty that we need more of a bet hedging or scenario planning approach. So that was a key thing in this work too, is like, how do we deal with uncertainty? And so that was a great thing to work through with the managers as well. Another thing in this area is that low elevation valleys are super important. In a lot of these mountainous areas, the low elevation valleys are key for wildlife movement, and they're also key for habitat. And so making sure that this is also important for our spatial priorities. There are areas in the Fraser River Valley, the Okanagan Valley, places that we could identify on maps that were critical for maintaining wildlife connectivity between these mountain ranges and also within them. So to make our findings easy to use for the managers, we prepared a whole bunch of different products. We had standalone reports for each of the species and vegetation communities that we worked on. And these reports describe the key climate impacts on connectivity that we identified. It describes the actions for addressing them. So what are the adaptation actions they can take? And it also identified those spatial priorities for implementation. Where should we be implementing these actions on the landscapes to promote connectivity under climate change? And they also included those conceptual models that we used to do this work, as well as maps for all of the climate and connectivity model outputs that were used to inform our work, and little descriptions of what those models mean, what the key sort of assumptions are, and sources of uncertainty in those models. We also made everything freely available online. We created a gallery on Databasin where you can access all of the reports that we put together, and there are galleries that have all of the data sets that we used as well. And again, this is a few years ago, so some of these data sets might look a lot different now, or we might use different ones, but this was what we considered to be sort of the best available science at the time. And so there's a sort of little sub-gallery for each of our case study species and systems where you can get the report and you can get all of those layers that we used, all of the model outputs. And on Databasin, you can layer these things, you can bring in your own layers and see how these align with your own conservation priorities and values. So it was really important to us to get a very easy to use, interactive way for folks to access this information, because accessing the science was such a key driver for this work, because folks didn't even know how to get hold of this information. So we were trying to make it really easy to do that. And then after we had built this gallery and put all this stuff online, we held workshops. We held a series of workshops around the Transboundary region that included not just the individual managers we worked with in the project, but also their colleagues. So they brought laptops with them so they could work with the data sets and really get their hands dirty, like get comfortable using these models, and also developing scenarios in which they could apply them to their work. So we asked people to come with, what are some aspects of your work around connectivity and climate change that you have questions about, or that you are relevant to your decision making. So they brought those with them, and then they worked on going through these galleries and looking at the data and how it could help support their decisions. And I will say that you can create great tools. You can create great data sets, great science. And sometimes the biggest barrier to folks using them is just getting them to sit down and begin. The intimidation factor for climate and connectivity models can be really high for managers who are not working in this field directly, who are not producing the science themselves. And so just taking the time to sit down with folks, to walk them through it and train them to use it is really important, and it's such an easy way to amplify the impact of your work. So unlike a typical academic research project, our results weren't just a single peer-reviewed paper. Instead, we had a whole suite of products that included an overview report that described the key findings and a description of our process as a model for how to collaboratively integrate climate change into connectivity, conservation decision-making. We also had all of our standalone reports for each of the case study species and vegetation systems. We have our online interactive database and gallery with case study reports and all of the associated climate and connectivity maps. And then I think one of the most important things that came out of this project was the enhanced capacity and the communities of practice that we built by getting folks involved. So we had at least 45 different workshop attendees across the course of the project, and that represented a wide range of agencies and tribes and NGOs, and then hundreds more were reached via our webinars and presentations. So this was, I mean, I know personally from working on this project, looking at pretty much everyone in these pictures now, these are valued colleagues, these are folks who I'm still in touch with, although I see now some of them have retired. But it really was effective at building a community and folks that people knew they could pick up the phone and call if they had a question about something. So if I was to give a key takeaway for this, it's that I really want to make sure folks realize that models alone, science alone, isn't enough to inform decision making. We need to be creating, thinking carefully about what it takes to take that science and really apply it to decision making. And it requires a lot of support and a lot of thinking about how to translate these really big picture findings and making them relevant to the decisions that people make, and thinking how to interpret them and apply them. And I think it's also, I think we were very successful then in building that capacity and building that collaboration, but we also recognized that capacity and collaboration aren't the only barriers to realizing large landscape connectivity and climate resilience, especially across international borders. So several years out, I don't see a lot of progress at actual land and wildlife management coordination across the border. I don't see corridors, you know, MOUs, peace park corridors spanning the border right now. So what's preventing that? And if we want to make sure that this kind of work is informed by science, we also know the kinds of static models that we used in this project. In other words, models that are really a snapshot of our understanding at a particular time. These aren't really a good fit for a rapidly changing world. Those models are obsolete the moment they're completed. It's using the land cover data at that time. It's using our whatever climate models and scenarios we had available at that time, species distribution maps we had at that time, and things are changing so fast that those things are it's already out of date. Sometimes many years out of date by the time you're finished. And it's a ton of work to redo those models. It's a ton of work to get the data you need to keep it up to date. And so I want to end by quickly introducing a project we're working on now that aims to address these challenges by going beyond needs for capacity and collaboration to ensure real, successful on-the-ground implementation of climate-smart connectivity at the landscape scale. And this is the Cascadia Conservation Climate Adaptation Strategy. This is an effort underway now in the Transboundary region of Washington, British Columbia, that's designed to facilitate regional scale conservation planning in a changing climate. The goal is to ensure that Cascadia, and again, this is the area around the Washington, British Columbia border, ensure that it has natural systems that are resilient to the impacts of climate change. These are connected systems that are maintaining their function in a changing climate. For that to be true, for us to achieve that, we need to have decision makers that are planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating conservation in ways and at scales that are sufficient to support the resilience of Cascadia systems. And for that to be true, yes, our land use decision makers need to have the capacity to understand and plan for climate resilience. Yes, they also do need to be collaborating and coordinated across boundaries to support climate resilience, but they also need to be motivated to support climate resilience. They need to have the authority to do it, so they need to be empowered to implement decisions that support climate resilience. And they need to have the funding to do it. So often talking to land and wildlife managers, it's not the science. They could have the best science in the world. They could know exactly what they need to do, but they don't have the mandate to do it. They're not authorized to do it. And even if they were, they don't have the money to do it. Or someone in the works isn't motivated to do it. And so this strategy is designed to help facilitate the process and provide the tools needed to make all of these enabling conditions present and working on the landscape, because we know the science alone isn't going to get us there. And so the strategy is being led by the Cascadia Partner Forum. The Partner Forum was formed in 2012. It's a network of natural resource managers and stakeholders in Washington, British Columbia, who recognize that we have to work across borders for conservation planning at the scale of climate change. And it's been working to develop the adaptation strategy as a necessary effort to coordinate management of our natural lands, our fish, and our wildlife across jurisdictional boundaries in Washington, British Columbia. It's led by a leadership council that represents some of the key conservation actors on the landscape and who have complementary responsibilities and expertise in land and wildlife management, science, policy, and funding. And this red area around here is the area we're going to be doing this work for, that we're calling Cascadia. The folks who are actually engaging in this process, the wider participation, is about 35 different institutional entities from both sides of the border that span federal, state, provincial, tribe, First Nation, non-governmental orgs, foundations, and academic partners. And while the strategy is focused on a holistic look at what we need to have connected, resilient landscapes in Cascadia, beyond good science to support on-the-ground resilience, we also recognize that with the rapid pace of change on the landscape, from climate change and human land use, and with the wide range of jurisdictions present at the large landscape scale we're working at, we also need new tools that support conservation planning under shifting baselines. So we've been working with Google to build a new tool that can provide land and wildlife managers with always up-to-date information to help guide their decisions. So we're moving beyond static models now. We want models that are constantly being updated with the latest information on what's happening in our landscapes. And the way that this tool works is that we have an app engine that's running a set of processes on a schedule. So it's scheduled right now to run every fall automatically. It's cloud-based. We don't have to manually redo these models. And once it's activated, the tool automatically updates all of the input layers, a lot of which is coming from Landsat imagery that is seamlessly transboundary, as well as whatever we want to put in there on transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, topography, climate, soils, whatever it is that we think is going to be useful for giving us this large landscape look at what's going on in our the areas that we're concerned about. The tool then uses Google Cloud technology, so Earth Engine, Compute Engine, and Cloud Storage to produce habitat and connectivity models, refugee models, et cetera, for each of our targets. So we're looking at different biomes, we're looking at a bunch of different species of concern, and it's synthesizing these spatial models into a spatial prioritization of the landscape. So I'm using whatever the managers and the scientists together decide are important to us for identifying those spatial priorities. We can get outputs of landscape integrity, so looking at naturalness of the landscape, looking at habitat connectivity and habitat for different species and biomes. We can look at disturbances, refugia, spatial priorities. And then these outputs are linked dynamically to our web viewer. So we get an automatic reporting system that can send users reports on trends that we're seeing in our area of interest. We have an alert system for warning of approaching risk recovery thresholds, for example, for our targets relative to the goals that we set. There's also some really awesome communications and storytelling components using Google Earth. So the Northwest CASC has funded a module of this tool right now to identify suitable habitat for wolverine in a changing climate. And in the past year with Northwest CASC funding, we've convened a working group of land and wildlife managers who are working with wolverine to together co-produce a model of wolverine habitat using the tool prototype. And here is a very early output of from the tool of wolverine denning habitat, showing areas that provide consistent long-term denning habitat. So that's green is areas of high suitability for wolverine denning habitat. Red is kind of marginal and orange is in between. And but note that the background image is actually green as well, and that's different from the green of the suitable areas. So this is a first output of the tool for this species. And now we're developing the connectivity models that will be working with this model. And we'll also be adding in models that can help us anticipate how suitable habitat and connectivity could change in the future as climate change progresses. So these models are going to be updated automatically every fall with new data from Landsat imagery and other inputs without any additional staff funding or time because they're automated and they're housed on Google Earth Engine. So that's a huge step above the kinds of models that we were using for our Transboundary project. And then if we run the model over multiple years, then we get a time series of habitat and connectivity that's useful for assessing trends. We can ask how suitable habitat and connectivity changing over time. Where should we be investing in conservation for wolverine resilience and connectivity? And we can also do evaluation and monitoring. Are we being successful? How is this changing over time? And are our interventions making a difference? And I want to make a big shout out to Andrew Shirk, a scientist at the Climate Impacts Group who's been leading the tool building effort. So again, the ultimate goal for this strategy, using our theory of change here, is to look at a series of conservation priorities, like at-risk species like wolverine and others, as well as landscape connectivity, freshwater and riparian habitats and other priorities, and to look at them all through the lens of these 5 enabling conditions. Do we have the capacity to do this? Do we have the coordination, the motivation, the authority, the funding? What is working now in for those 5 lenses, and what do we need to put in place so that we have the enabling conditions to identify key actions and actors and implement on the ground conservation so that we can achieve a connected, resilient Cascadia. And we're super grateful to our funders for supporting this pretty ambitious effort, and to all of the conservation stakeholders across the Transboundary region for engaging in this process. A lot of us have been working on different iterations of this work in Cascadia for a long time, and this is a really exciting next step that really builds off of lessons learned in the past about what might be necessary but is insufficient for really achieving on-the-ground action. So folks are really recognizing, I can say from all of the work that I do outside of this with the Climate Impacts Group and the CASC, hearing again and again from wildlife managers that they know from what they're seeing, they're not going to be able to meet their mandates alone. They can't work as isolated islands in a much larger landscape as it undergoes rapid change. So we're really excited about this new effort and the chance to build upon all the good work that's going on in our region over the past years to develop a really effective partnership for large landscape conservation under climate change in the Northwest. So thank you all so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mead, for your presentation. So Michelle, you're now unmuted. Feel free to ask your question.
My question is actually, where can I access that information, the scientific information, and is there a link that I could get a hold of?
Is that for the database and gallery I showed earlier from the, I can send.
There will be a follow-up email where I will email everyone who signed up, and I can include the link to the taped webinar and also any additional information, such as a direct link to the website.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, next question is Bray.
Excellent. Hi, Mead.
Hey, Bray.
I have a question about the last process that you showed us, the automation. Are you creating those models from, let's say, like current times into the future, or can you, if you were to set this up, could you go and run the models starting in, like, I don't know, 1984? The reason I'm asking is because when we look at connectivity, a lot of the opportunity has been lost since then. Mm-hmm. It would be very interesting to understand how much opportunity was lost, and to have to be able to reference that for funders and just give that background as far as how much we've lost. So Does the model have that capability, or is it just from a certain time forward?
No, it does, and I'm pretty sure I've seen it do that already with hindcat. Yeah, so it does. You can look back as well. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that would be an option as well, but yeah, you can. Although it'll depend on what all you're looking at, right? So if you're just looking at the satellite imagery, like that goes back several years, right? So you can do that, but some of the data layers that we might put in there may or may not run back that far.
Got it. Okay. Thanks.
The next question is Janet Cushing. She says, thank you for your presentation. And she says, I'll be curious to see how this kind of effort can be done in a virtual setting if we have to do this social distancing thing for a while. And she also asked if we could get a copy of the slides afterwards, which could obviously go out with that email that Elda will be following up with you folks on.
Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides. As far as the remote question, I think actually we can do a lot of this remotely. We're already in other parts of my work. We're switching. We have like entire workshops and stuff that we have scheduled for this spring that we're switching to online format, and then also just completely rethinking how, like for a 2-day workshop, we're not going to have a 2-day workshop that's remote. I mean, that's like torture. And so we've rethought an entire process around how we can set up remote working groups that, meet sort of at scattered times over the course of, a couple months. And how can we make that flexible and creative? And I think this is going to be the same thing for folks who, I know some of you are probably maybe really quickly now getting online using things like Zoom, but for the Climate Impacts Group and the Climate Adaptation Science Center, we've been using Zoom heavily for the last several years. We have entire leadership councils that are almost entirely on Zoom, and it is amazing how just it is face-to-face interaction, even though it's not in person. You really can get to know somebody pretty well when you can video chat with them. It's not the same. It's not the same as being truly in person, but you can get a long way toward that. And so I think where we are right now, it looks like this could go on for a while, right? I don't think it's going to serve us to say we have to wait and have in-person workshops when this is all over. I think the plan is, essentially that's what we're looking at right now, is that we're going to have a bunch of working groups around each of our priority species and around connectivity and around the species and around freshwater and riparian systems, like a bunch of the priorities we want to work on immediately. And we're going to set up working groups for each one of those, consisting of land and wildlife managers who are working on that issue on either side of the border, as well as the scientists. And these are not supposed to be huge groups. So you can do a lot of, I think what we'll do is have core teams who are really, really hands-on and invested in working on this. It might be a smaller group of maybe 10. You can do a lot with the 10-person working group online, meeting regularly, using something like Zoom, and then have larger webinars for sort of the broader interest group, and try to do the work that way, until the time at which we're able to meet in person. So it's not ideal, but I think we can still make a lot of progress. Recognizing the human, who knows, things will be evolving quickly in the next several weeks, but that's our goal for now.
Thank you. Next question is from Maxwell Kelly. I work in land use planning in Alberta, and I was wondering if you're aware of any similar types of ongoing initiatives between Montana and Alberta.
Oh, let me get out a map. Bri, you should speak up. Isn't that more in your neck of the woods? There's a whole bunch of different stuff with Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. There's Heart of the Rockies, the Crown of the Continent. I'm probably muddling up all kinds of geographies here, but there are things to the east of us. I know that for sure. I'm not sure. I think I might be messing up the boundaries of some of those efforts, and some of them are nested within them. There's smaller geographies of concern within the Y2Y region. Well, they're out there.
Is it Bri or Bray? Sorry about that.
Bri.
Right. Okay. Yeah. You said all those were right, Mead.
All of the above. Okay. So look up Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. Look up Crown of the Continent and Heart of the Rockies. Oh, and there's a Crown Managers partnership, which I think overlaps with one of those two, maybe with Crown of the Continent.
Okay. I would like to thank Mead and Elda and all the people at USGS that help us with this presentation. Oh, Kelly asks, thanks, Mead. Have you communicated with other parts of the country who are wanting to do similar connectivity conservation work, whether transboundary, cross-state, etc.? It seems like the strategy and tools you presented can be implemented elsewhere. Surely the Google models could be worldwide. I am in the Gulf of Mexico region for context.
Yeah, so actually, as far as the tool goes, let's see. So David Tao, who was leading Google's, I'm not going to remember what the effort's called, but it's basically like the Google for Good arm that takes Earth Engine and helps implement it for these kinds of projects. So he recently moved to World Wildlife Fund, and he's still really heavily involved in the tool development. And there's a lot of interest in already like implementing the tool, even as we're building it, like in other all the way across the globe right now. And so this is something we're balancing, is how to maintain the focus on Cascadia and really getting this thing right here versus the need for it elsewhere. The long-term goal is that this thing, it's sort of being proofed and piloted here in the Cascadia region, but that the goal is to make this a globally available tool and to provide support for that in the long run. So yes, it will be available. As far as other efforts like this, there's a lot of informal discussion and collaboration with other folks who are doing this kind of work, like Nature Conservancy, Y2Y. There's other conservation design work going on here, more to the west of us, along the coast, the Cascade to Coast Collaborative. I think I saw John Mankowski on the call here who's working on that. So there are other efforts going on, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel even in our process. And so, yeah, we're definitely keeping an eye out and having discussions with folks around that, though there could always be room for improvement with cross-pollination with other efforts.
Okay, thank you, Mead, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone who was able to attend today, and thank you, and y'all have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.